Your services are no longer required, doctor.
You'll never have to question my integrity.
Rainy Tuesday morning, the operating room doors of Daehan Royal Medical Center slid open. For nearly 12 hours, one of Seoul's most difficult heart transplant surgeries had held the hospital's finest specialists captive inside Operating Theater 1. Outside, exhausted family members stood from the leather seats lining the executive waiting lounge. Some clasped their hands tightly. Others silently prayed. When the lead surgeon finally stepped through the doors, every conversation stopped. Dr. Zara Okoye slowly removed her surgical cap, revealing neatly tied natural curls damp from hours beneath the operating lights. Her caramel complexion showed unmistakable fatigue, yet her steady brown eyes carried the calm confidence everyone in the hospital had come to recognize. Behind her followed anesthesiologists, nurses, perfusionists, and surgical residents. Every member of the team looked exhausted. Then Zara smiled. The surgery was successful. Relief exploded through the waiting area. An elderly woman burst into tears before embracing one of the nurses. A young businessman dropped to his knees, thanking God. Several relatives bowed repeatedly toward the surgical team. Zara accepted every thank you with quiet humility. The real work starts now, she reminded them gently. He still needs time to recover. As the family hurried toward the intensive care unit, one young resident shook his head in amazement. I've never seen anyone stay that focused for 12 hours. Another resident laughed quietly. That's why patients wait months just to get her. Across the observation balcony overlooking the cardiac wing, Vice President Han Seo-yeon watched the celebration with an expression impossible to read. The applause below irritated her more than she cared to admit. Every newspaper seemed to praise Dr. Farah. International medical journals requested interviews. Patients flew in from Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and across Asia specifically asking for her by name. She had become the face of Daehan Royal Medical Center. That popularity, however, created a problem. Hospitals depended upon wealthy donors. Wealthy donors expected special treatment. Dr. Zara refused to give it. To her, every human heart deserved the same urgency. That philosophy inspired patience. But it frustrated people accustomed to buying influence. Vice President Han quietly turned away from the balcony. Doctors should heal, she muttered. They shouldn't become celebrities. Meanwhile, Zara returned to the staff lounge. She poured herself a cup of tea before opening the day's surgical schedule. Another 5 procedures, 3 consultations, a lecture for visiting residents. She smiled to herself. Busy meant lives were being saved. That was enough. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Professor Baek Jin-hwan entered carrying 2 coffee cups. I thought you'd need something stronger. She accepted the coffee gratefully. You always know. He sat opposite her. You've officially broken another hospital record. She looked confused. What record? The fastest recovery rate following complex transplants. She laughed softly. The nurses deserve most of that credit. Professor Beck smiled knowingly. You always say that. Because it's true. He studied her for a moment. You know, not everyone upstairs appreciates how popular you've become. Zara shrugged. I wasn't hired to be popular. I was hired to operate. Professor Beck nodded. I just hope they remember the difference. That afternoon, the executive surgical floor buzzed with controlled urgency. Nurses prepared patients. Residents reviewed scans. Families quietly filled luxurious waiting lounges, overlooking the Han River. Suddenly, the silence broke. I don't care what the schedule says. A loud voice echoed through the reception area. I donated nearly $20 million to this hospital. A sharply dressed businessman stood at the front desk, visibly furious. Beside him stood his son, who required heart surgery within the week, but whose condition was stable. Hospital staff exchanged nervous glances. The receptionist immediately called for Dr. Zara. Moments later, she arrived carrying a digital tablet. Good afternoon. The businessman folded his arms. I've decided my son's surgery will happen tomorrow. Zara reviewed the chart calmly. I'm afraid tomorrow's operating list is already reserved. I know. Move someone. Her expression remained composed. Everyone currently scheduled requires emergency intervention. My son's condition is important. It is, Zara agreed. And we've scheduled his operation appropriately. I didn't ask for appropriately. I asked for first. The waiting area fell silent. Several nurses lowered their eyes. Everyone knew how these conversations usually ended. The donor always won. But Zara gently closed the patient's file. Our operating rooms aren't reserved by wealth. They're reserved by medical urgency. The businessman stared at her in disbelief. You realize who I am?
Ido.
And my answer remains the same. His face darkened. You'll regret embarrassing me. I hope your son receives an excellent operation. She smiled politely. And he will. But not at another patient's expense. Without another word, she walked away. The businessman remained frozen before storming toward the executive offices. High above the cardiac department, Vice President Han watched everything unfold through the glass walls overlooking the reception area. A slow smile appeared. So predictable. Minutes later, the furious donor entered her office. She listened patiently, occasionally nodding, never interrupting. When he finally finished, she folded her hands. I'll handle the situation. That same afternoon, a sleek black luxury sedan quietly entered the hospital's executive entrance. Out stepped Kong Min-jae,
Tall.
impeccably dressed.
Calm.
Most people recognized him only as chairman of Hanol Global Investments. Few knew the whispers surrounding his private life. He entered the hospital without ceremony. Only Security Director Im Do-hyun accompanied him. Your board meeting begins in 20 minutes, Im reminded him. As they crossed the executive corridor, raised voices drifted from an office. That surgeon has become impossible to control. Donors are growing frustrated. Min-jae glanced briefly toward the closed door. What was that about? Im looked toward the office. Probably another administrative disagreement. Min-jae simply nodded. He continued walking, completely unaware that the conversation concerned the very surgeon whose life was about to change. 3 mornings later, Daehan Royal Medical Center awoke to chaos. A computer scheduling malfunction delayed several executive surgeries. Patients complained. Families became anxious. Reporters began calling the communications office. The actual problem lasted less than 30 minutes. The technical department identified the software error almost immediately. Normally, the issue would have ended there. Instead, Vice President Han saw an opportunity. By lunchtime, emergency board members had been summoned. A thick investigation file rested on the polished walnut conference table. Dr. Zara entered the executive boardroom, wearing her white physician's coat. She immediately sensed something was wrong. No one smiled. Chairman Lee Sang-go cleared his throat. Please have a seat. She obeyed quietly. Vice President Han began speaking. Our investigation suggests repeated failures of departmental leadership. Slides appeared on the enormous screen. Emails, scheduling reports, internal complaints. Each piece of evidence seemed convincing. Yet Zara immediately noticed something strange. Important messages were missing. Entire conversations had disappeared. Context had been removed. She calmly raised her hand. Several of those emails are incomplete. Han answered immediately. The board has reviewed everything considered relevant. I respectfully disagree. Chairman Lee hesitated. Dr. Zara, you'll have an opportunity after the presentation. She nodded, but that opportunity never truly came. Each time she attempted to explain, another document appeared, another accusation, another carefully edited timeline. Professor Beck sat silently at the far end of the table. His expression grew increasingly troubled. He knew something wasn't right, but he lacked proof. Finally, Chairman Lee spoke. The board will now vote. Within less than 2 minutes, the decision was made. Employment terminated effective immediately. Silence filled the room. Zara neither argued nor pleaded. She slowly unclipped her hospital identification badge, placed it gently upon the polished table, then stood. I sincerely hope, she said quietly, that every future decision made here places patients before politics. No one answered. She bowed respectfully, collected the small box containing her personal belongings, and walked out with her dignity intact. As the boardroom doors closed behind her, Professor Beck stared at the untouched ID badge resting on the table. For the first time in his long career, he realized the hospital had not just lost its finest surgeon, it had made the biggest mistake in its history. The effects of Zara's dismissal were not immediate. For the first 48 hours, Daehan Royal Medical Center continued operating as though nothing had happened. Surgeries proceeded. Executives reassured donors. The hospital released a carefully worded public statement thanking Dr. Zara Okoye for her years of service, while insisting that patient care would remain unaffected. Vice President Han Seo-yeon considered the crisis over. She was wrong. By the beginning of the following week, cracks began appearing everywhere. The first cancellation came from a Japanese businessman who had waited 5 months for reconstructive heart surgery. "I'm sorry," his assistant told the scheduling office. Mr. Nishida agreed to this operation because Dr. Okoye would be leading it. Another patient postponed her procedure indefinitely. A diplomat quietly transferred to another hospital. Then, a retired Olympic athlete requested his complete medical records. Within days, nearly a dozen complex cardiac cases had been moved elsewhere. The waiting list that had once been the hospital's greatest source of pride was suddenly disappearing. The atmosphere inside the cardiac department changed completely. Residents who had trained under Zara struggled to stay motivated. Several experienced nurses submitted resignation letters. One operating room stood and used almost every afternoon. The silence inside the surgical wing felt unnatural. Professor Beck Jin-hwan walked through the empty corridor, pausing outside Operating Theater 1. Only a week earlier, it had been impossible to reserve. Now the lights remained off. He entered the theater alone. The spotless room reflected back at him. He remembered Zara calmly teaching residents after difficult surgeries, encouraging every nurse by name, and staying late to explain procedures to worried families. He sighed deeply. This room shouldn't be empty. That afternoon, Professor Beck entered another board meeting uninvited. The directors looked surprised. Chairman Lee adjusted his glasses. "Professor?" Beck placed several folders on the conference table. "Their cancellation reports." Nobody moved. "Patients are leaving." Vice President Han remained composed. That was expected. Professor Beck looked directly at her.
No.
"What we're seeing isn't temporary." He opened another file. 8 nurses have resigned. 2 researchers accepted offers overseas. Our fellowship applications have fallen dramatically. The room grew quiet. Then he delivered the sentence no one wanted to hear. "You didn't fire one surgeon." He slowly looked around the table. "You dismantled an entire team." No one challenged him. Even Chairman Lee lowered his eyes. Across Seoul, Kang Min-jae sat inside the executive offices of Hanol Global Investments. Morning sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River. Security Director Im Do-hyun entered carrying a thick black folder. "You asked me to investigate Dr. Zara Okoye." Min-jae closed the financial report he had been reading. "What did you find?" Im placed the folder on the desk. "Nothing." Min-jae raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?"
No misconduct. No negligence.
"No ethical violations." He slid several documents across the polished desk. "What I did find was far more interesting." The first document contained the original surgery schedules. The second showed the edited version presented to the board. Entire sections had disappeared. Next came internal emails. Several had been altered through selective forwarding. Important replies had been omitted. Then security logs. Vice President Han had held private meetings with the billionaire donor on 3 separate occasions before Zara's dismissal. Finally, Im produced the board meeting transcript. The recording confirms Dr. Okoye was interrupted 6 times before she could finish explaining the missing information. Min-jae quietly read every page. His expression never changed. When he reached the final document, he closed the folder. "So," he said calmly, "she wasn't dismissed because she failed."
No.
She refused to compromise medical ethics.
And nodded.
And someone decided integrity was inconvenient. Several seconds passed. Min-jae stood and walked toward the enormous window overlooking Seoul. The city stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. Without turning around, he asked one simple question. How much of Daehan Royal Medical Center is available for purchase?
Smiled slightly.
I anticipated that question. He opened another folder. The founding family wants to sell. Several shareholders are already considering offers. A controlling interest can be acquired legally. Min-jae looked back. Begin negotiations. Quietly. Mid-video CTA. If you're enjoying this story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Stories like these remind us that integrity may be challenged, but it can never truly be defeated. And if you love emotional Korean drama stories filled with unforgettable twists and satisfying endings, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful journey. 3 weeks later, financial headlines stunned the country. Hanol Global Investments acquires controlling interest in Daehan Royal Medical Center. Television anchors interrupted business programs. Medical journals rushed to publish updates. Hospital employees stared at their phones in disbelief. No one had expected one of Korea's largest investment groups to purchase a controlling share of the hospital almost overnight. Inside the executive boardroom, tension filled the air. Chairman Lee sat silently. Vice President Han tried to remain composed. Then the doors opened. Kang Min-jae entered wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. Behind him walked legal advisors, financial officers, and security director Im Do-hyun.
No bodyguards. No dramatic entrance.
Only quiet confidence. He greeted everyone politely before taking his seat at the head of the table. The room fell silent. Chairman Lee cleared his throat. Congratulations on the acquisition. Min-jae inclined his head. Thank you.
Vice-President Han Pukakarafuli.
We assume restructuring will begin immediately. Several executives exchanged nervous glances. They expected layoffs, department closures, budget cuts. Instead, Min-jae folded his hands calmly on the polished table. I did not purchase this hospital to reduce excellence. Everyone looked at him. I purchased it to restore trust. He nodded toward his legal team. Effective today, an independent governance review begins. Every dismissal, every promotion, every disciplinary action taken over the last 3 years will be reviewed. Vice President Han's confident expression faltered for the first time. Min-jae continued. If every decision was made fairly, he said, evenly, then no one has anything to fear. The room became perfectly still. Only Im Do-hyun noticed Vice President Han quietly tightening her grip beneath the table. For the first time since Zara had walked out carrying a small cardboard box, the truth was finally beginning to find its way back into the hospital. 2 weeks after the acquisition, every member of the hospital board received an invitation marked mandatory governance review. The same executive boardroom overlooked the Han River. The same polished walnut table reflected the morning sunlight. The same directors took their seats. Only one thing had changed. At precisely 9 o'clock, Kang Min-jae entered and quietly sat at the head of the table. There was no dramatic speech.
No intimidation.
Only a calm nod. Good morning. Independent investigators entered behind him carrying several sealed evidence folders. The lead auditor placed a projector on the conference table. For the past 14 days, she began, our team has reviewed every document related to Dr. Zara Okoye's dismissal. The first slide appeared. Original emails. The second. Edited emails presented to the former board. Gasps filled the room. The missing paragraphs completely changed the meaning of the conversations. Next came security footage. Vice President Han meeting privately with the influential donor only hours before the emergency board meeting. Then scheduling records. Meeting minutes. Financial correspondence. Every piece formed the same picture. The investigation concluded that Dr. Zara had committed no professional misconduct. Instead, evidence showed that internal information had been selectively presented to influence the board's decision. Chairman Lee slowly removed his glasses. His hands trembled. I should have asked more questions. Professor Beck lowered his head. I should have spoken. Vice President Han remained silent for several seconds before finally standing. I accept responsibility. Her voice had lost its usual confidence. I believed protecting powerful relationships protected the hospital. She looked around the room. I was wrong. She quietly placed her executive identification card on the table. I hereby resign. No one celebrated. There was only silence. Kong Min-jae finally spoke. This hospital cannot change by replacing one person. He looked around the table. It changes when every leader remembers why hospitals exist. Every director nodded. For the first time in years, the boardroom felt less like a corporate office and more like a place of accountability. Several hours outside Seoul, Dr. Zara Okoye stood inside a modest nonprofit medical center. Unlike Daehan Royal, there were no marble floors or executive lounges. The walls were simple. The equipment was older. But every patient smiled when she entered the room. She had found peace. Medicine felt uncomplicated again. After finishing a consultation, the receptionist approached. "Doctor, someone is here to see you."
Outside waited him doyon.
He greeted her respectfully. "Dr. Okoye." She smiled politely. "I wasn't expecting visitors. I've brought something." He handed her a cream-colored envelope embossed with the hospital's new seal. She opened it. Inside was a single letter. The board of Daehan Royal Medical Center formally invited her to return, not merely as a surgeon, but as director of cardiothoracic innovation, with complete academic independence, authority to build her own surgical team, and responsibility for training the next generation of heart surgeons. Attached beneath it was a handwritten note.
No institution deserves forgiveness.
But every institution deserves the opportunity to become better. Kong Min-jae. Zara remained silent for a long moment.
Waited patiently.
Finally, she looked up. "Has the hospital truly changed?" He answered honestly. "It's changing. That isn't the same thing."
No.
"It isn't." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps that's enough." 1 month later, applause echoed throughout the hospital's grand auditorium.
Doctors.
Nurses. Researchers. Medical students. Every seat was filled. Chairman Lee stepped to the podium. "Today," he said quietly, "we welcome home someone we should never have lost." Dr. Zara walked onto the stage. The standing ovation lasted nearly a full minute. She waited until the room became quiet. "I've agreed to return." Another wave of applause followed. She gently raised a hand, but only under one condition. The audience listened carefully. "No serien," she said, "should ever fear telling the truth." Kong Min-jae stood from the front row. "You have my word." Within weeks, changes spread throughout the hospital. An independent ethics office opened. Anonymous reporting systems protected staff. Emergency scheduling became fully transparent. Promotion committees included outside medical experts. Young residents received mentorship scholarships regardless of background or nationality. Professor Beck smiled as he watched junior doctors openly discuss difficult cases without fear. "This," he whispered, "is what a teaching hospital should feel like." 6 months later, Daehan Royal Medical Center had become one of Asia's most respected cardiac institutions. International fellows arrived from 5 continents. Medical journals praised its reforms. Patient satisfaction reached record levels. Most importantly, trust had returned. One quiet evening, Kong Min-jae walked through the cardiac wing after finishing a board meeting. He noticed young surgeons gathered around Dr. Zara as she reviewed a complex case. She encouraged questions, corrected mistakes gently, celebrated good ideas regardless of who offered them. The atmosphere reminded him why he had invested in the hospital in the first place. After the session ended, Zara stepped into the corridor overlooking the illuminated Seoul skyline. Min-jae joined her. "They seem inspired." She smiled. "They remind me why I became a doctor." For a moment, both admired the glowing city below. Finally, Min-jae spoke. "When people heard I bought this hospital," he said softly, "they assumed it was to bring someone back." Zara looked toward him. "And was it?" He shook his head.
No.
"I bought it because no hospital should ever lose its best people for doing the right thing." She considered his words before replying. "You didn't save my career. You simply removed the walls that were keeping others from doing theirs." They shared a quiet smile. Inside the hospital behind them, doctors hurried through brightly lit corridors. Patients were treated according to urgency instead of influence. Residents learned to speak honestly. Nurses worked knowing their voices mattered. As the camera slowly pulled back beyond the glass facade, Daehan Royal Medical Center shone above the Han River, not as the hospital it had once been, but as the hospital it had finally become. A place where excellence was protected, where integrity mattered, and where every patient, regardless of status or wealth, received the dignity they deserved.